AI is everywhere. It's showing up in all our Google searches and it's all over social media. But what does this say about society and the future of technology? Welcome to our podcast, AI, Algorithmic Inequity. I'm Ellen Andrews. I'm a fourth-year student at Mount Allison University in Sackville, New Brunswick. I'm doing a major in sociology and a minor in women and gender studies, and I use she/they pronouns.
And I'm Claire Barton. I also go to Mount Allison, and I'm a third-year English honors student with a minor in feminist and gender studies, and my pronouns are she/they. In this podcast, we'll be looking at the different ways that generative AI impacts women in the workplace and how biases targeting women and other marginalized communities are built into these systems due to a lack of representation in the computing and ICT industries. We and many others have a lot of concerns about AI, so we wanted to have an informed conversation about the risks associated with AI and how it impacts women and other marginalized communities, as well as some solutions to this complex question.
So we wanted to start this episode just by talking about some of our own observations that we've seen with AI and our own, interactions with it. And like I said, we see it everywhere in social media and in Google searches. In when you open a Google Doc, there's an AI suggestion thing on there.
Mm-hmm.
And do you remember we were doing research, and when we were doing a Google search about the harms that AI can cause, there were AI summaries about the harms that AI can cause.
Yeah, every Google search it would show up that you would put, I remember I think it was pay equity and generative AI, and the first thing that shows up is this AI summary of I don't even remember, of pay equity, I guess. And I was like, that just goes against exactly what I was asking for.
Yeah, it's ironic how, because I think I was just searching what impact can AI have on women's work, or how can it cause gender inequity or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And Google gave me an AI summary. So we had to, with all our Google searches, type -AI after, which I do for most of my Google searches now.
Yeah, no, but I've done it recently and it started not working.
Really?
Yeah, I would put it in and it would still give me the AI search, and I saw someone on TikTok say that if you put a swear word, then it'll take it out. And so I was like, do I have to start putting swear words in all of my questions?
Yeah,
just so I don't get AI.
Yeah, it's still working for me, but who knows how long that will last.
Mm-hmm.
And even in a more sort of professional example, even in the research databases that we have with the library, they were giving us AI recommendations and summaries as well when we were doing research for this project. I can't remember which one it was. But
I know there was one, I think it was Statista.
Yeah.
Would give a research AI tab at the top. And I remember too in ProQuest, I think it was, when you'd look up an article and you'd click on it, it would give you a summary on the side, and it would also give you other examples of sources you could find and that you could use, which I guess would make it easier to find these sources, but it's still, you're using AI to do the research for you, basically.
Yeah, I think in academics as well, in classes, most of my professors say either not to use it, or to you can use it for this, but you can't use it for this.
Mm-hmm. Or tell me when you use it, and I'll mark you based off of that.
But I know there are some who just don't care. They just use it, do whatever, and I think that can be quite questionable.
Yeah, I had a prof last semester who would use it in class with us as an example of we would read a book, and then he would put it up on the screen of you can use AI to look up a summary and to give you a summary of this book to help you with whatever assignment we were doing. And I was just first off, you can search for those things. There are resources you can use to find summaries that you don't use AI, but also just to use it blatantly in front of the students was crazy to me.
Yeah, so I try to avoid it as best as I can.
Yeah,
I don't really use ChatGPT or anything.
No.
But sometimes in classes, if there's a question, I do sometimes see students typing the questions into ChatGPT. And like, I guess like, I don't know, but sometimes I kind of find it a little bit annoying because it's sort of, some of us are doing the thinking and then some people are just letting AI do everything for them. And I think, how much are you actually learning from that?
I've seen a lot of discourse about that.
Yeah.
And to be honest, like, AI just kind of scares me.
Yeah, me
like,
too.
I'm just like, where is this coming from? Like, whose information am I taking? Like, this could be like plagiarized on plagiarized. Like, it could just, like, you don't know where it's coming from. And I know people who like are open about the fact that they use it for their assignments, and they talk about how it helps them get their work done. And I'm like, I get how that works for you, but it's like, you can't use it forever. Like, you can't use it to help you forever. Like, eventually you're going to go into the workforce and you're going to have to do all these things that you can't use AI for. And how are you going to know how to do it? Like, the people who are using it in the sciences and they're going to go on to become doctors or something, and then not know how to do something because they just got AI to write all their assignments for me. Like, it's crazy.
Yeah. And it's kind of scary, and even just with like how realistic some of the images are getting as well. And I've seen even like Donald Trump using it for different things. Yeah, he's posted some things on Instagram that are just...
Oh, wait, I think I do remember that.
Yeah, it's just insane. Like, oh.
I know.
And yeah, but I don't know, people could get in a lot of trouble from an AI-generated image of them. I don't know. But
yeah, or even the people, like, I know someone who got caught, quotation marks, for using AI when they didn't in their paper or something. Oh. And they were like, I didn't use it. Like, I don't know why it's getting flagged for this. Whereas I feel like the people that I know who use it semi all the time don't get caught.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, how useful are the tools that profs and teachers are using to like flag for this? Are they just flagging is it just like an AI trying to flag an AI? Like, how does that work? Or is it just there's like tips and tricks that they just know of that they can spot it? Like, I don't understand how they're catching people when they're catching people who aren't using it.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions and concerns about AI, and that's why we're here. So to get into some of our research, in an article called Feminism Confronts AI, the Gender Relations of Digitalization, we found that women are underrepresented in what they call a digital revolution. And what this means is that worldwide, around 327 million fewer women than men own a smartphone and can access the internet. So there's going to be a lot of sort of repercussions of that. And if AI is getting really big and women have less access to that, what are sort of the impacts that can have? And as for how this is represented in different countries across the world, only 17% of ICT specialists in Europe are women, and more specifically in the UK, only 19% of tech workers are women.
In Canada, women make up less than 30% of the tech industry, but yet they encompass approximately 50% of the total workforce. And in the United States, they compose a slightly higher number of positions at 31.5%, but they still encompass approximately 60% of the total workforce comparatively. And so overall, there are less women in tech-based occupations across all sectors internationally.
Yeah, it's crazy, the underrepresentation. Yeah.
You think it's getting better, but it's slow.
Yeah, so worldwide, our research showed that women make up around 26% of workers in data and AI roles, according to the World Economic Forum in 2020. In 2018, Wired and Element AI found that only 10 to 15% of machine learning researchers were women, and women of colour are further underrepresented, with only 1.6% of Google's US workforce being black women in 2020. So as we're going to sort of discuss later on with this underrepresentation, where these biases, how biases can come in because of this lack of representation. In some other major tech companies, Google found that only 11.3% of their workforce were women, and Microsoft found that it was 11.95%.
And more broadly, women make up about 28% of STEM positions versus a little over 47% of all other positions across various sectors. So with this, women make up less than 40% of data and analytic positions that decline the higher up one goes. So say a woman was in a junior position, that could be a certain percentage that women make up, but the higher you go, so the more senior you get, there's less women in the tech industry, which is interesting.
And this marginalization does actually influence technology quite a bit, but the awareness about the ways that gender intersects with other aspects of difference and disadvantage is growing, but I think there are a lot of people who still aren't aware of it. So I think, as we're hoping to do with this podcast, is to raise some more awareness about these issues and the issues that can rise as a result of this lack of representation.
And I think for a lot of people, even though maybe we don't tend to think about it, I think tech is still a very new thing because it's constantly evolving. And so like something that was new last year is not necessarily new anymore, but there's like a new version of it. So there's constantly newness to it, for lack of a better word. And so I think that's what a lot of people sometimes struggle with, is just keeping up with it. And then they just kind of get caught of like, they don't understand how it works and it's too complicated to learn how it works. And so they just let it happen.
And like considering how marginalization works as well, there are a lot of sort of stigmas and forms of like hatred, oppression and bigotry and bias that show up in every area of society. And like sort of anybody who isn't like a cisgender heterosexual white man is going to have some form of sort of bias against them or face some level of oppression and
at a disadvantage.
Yeah. And if the people who are building these AI technologies are sort of the most dominant people, how is this marginalization that exists throughout society, how is this going to show up in AI technology?
That will be discussed in another episode in depth. But yeah, I think it's just interesting. I think a lot of people don't think about that, of like when someone is creating something that, like when they're creating something, they're going to use their own experience for it. If they're the dominant group in society, they're going to use that experience with dominance to inform how they create something, whereas everyone else is going to be affected by that because it's not made for them.
Exactly.
And when something isn't made for somebody, then they just don't benefit from it, and it just doesn't work. Yeah.
And last year I did a class on digital sociology where we discussed this sort of thing in depth, and how different technologies just aren't made for certain people. So as we mainly discuss in this podcast for women, but it's also sort of other things as well about how accessible these technologies are for disabled people, or like face recognition for people who aren't white. It just shows up in so many ways that I think a lot of people don't realize.
Yeah, like one of the examples that I talk about later is how it shows up in healthcare, and how like when using AI to diagnose, it bases the symptoms off of those of like a cis white man. And if you're not a cis white man, it might misdiagnose you, and then you go in thinking, oh my gosh, I have this thing, and then you actually don't, and it could be better or it could be worse, and you could actually be facing like a life-threatening thing, like a life-threatening illness, but it doesn't tell you because that doesn't happen with cis men.
Exactly. So, like we've said, intersectionality is always important to remember. So, for example, do women who are poor or women of colour tend to be even more impacted by the negative effects of digitalization and automation?
So, for those who don't know what intersectionality is, kind of like a rough definition is, it was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it kind of focuses on how different parts of someone's identity, so their race, their class, their gender, their sexuality, etc., how those intersect, and how they kind of pile on each other to create different forms of oppression and marginalization. So say someone was a white woman, well, they would be oppressed based off of their gender. But if someone was a black woman, then they are oppressed based off of their race and their gender. And so how that kind of works within society to kind of, it's not like one dimensional, like oppression isn't one dimensional. So someone could experience oppression at the same time as someone else, but it's different. I don't know. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, it looks at how sort of at the intersection, if you imagine like two lines crossing over, like making a cross at that intersection in the middle, if you have like race and gender in the middle, it like creates a unique experience. And then you might have sexuality in there as well, and whether, you know, disability, whether they're like cis or trans or non-binary. And it also looks at like the roots of where different forms of oppression come from. And if you look back at the roots, you can see a lot of them do come from the same place. So they're all interrelated, so you can't really look at them separately.
I think kind of also to kind of end with that, like the way that Crenshaw kind of talked about it was that there was this woman who they were like, you can't be oppressed because you're a black woman. You have to be oppressed because you're either black or because you're a woman. You have to pick. And then they didn't understand that because she was a black woman, like that was another form of oppression, and that was like different in a sense. So
So always remember intersectionality. It's not, you know, when discussing feminism, it's like a crucial thing to has to be like at the core of it, I guess.
To be inclusive and to understand everyone's different perspective and life experience.
Yeah. So interestingly, did you know that computer programming was originally the invention of women, which was recalled by feminist historian Ma Hicks? But as the industry of computers and IT became more male-dominated, it became more professionalized. And then, because it, you know, became like a professional, you know, like in air quotes, professional sort of industry, and women are supposed to be domestic, then, you know, it became much more dominated by men. And now, because of this male domination and the absence of women, especially women of colour, what gets produced is significantly influenced by that.
Yeah. And in a 2024 article called The AI Boom is Here, But Where Are the Women?, it talked about how women tend to leave the tech industry in higher numbers than men because of low morale and overwork, and do so mostly before the age of 35. So that kind of goes back to what I was saying about how there's less women in senior positions, because they're all leaving before they get there because of the work conditions that they're in. And so these reasons are also because of a lack of benefits, which include little to no leave, unjust pay, and frequent layoffs, which do disproportionately affect women. And for example, with layoffs, women are 1.6 times more likely to be laid off.
But I think it's important for us to question where the representation is unequal and where human bias in gender, race, sexuality, and the intersection of these exist. How does this then show up in AI? And how can AI perpetuate that? That's something, I think, something to think about, something that we'll look at, something that we'll look into a lot more in the upcoming episodes. But yeah, I think just as we said, people aren't without bias, and maybe it's unconscious.
Yeah.
And especially, I think, the more sort of privileged you are and the more, I guess, dominant identities you have, one, the more likely you are to be working in this industry, and then sort of maybe unconsciously put your biases into them as well.
And I think for sometimes a lot of people, it's hard to acknowledge those unconscious bias, which is fair, but it's also an important part, I think, of life, is to acknowledge how your privilege affects your position in life and how it disadvantages others, and what you can do to work around that and to acknowledge it and to do better.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a report from the Information and Communications Technology Council from 2022 stated that Cord, which is a messaging tool that connects technical talents with hiring teams across London, New York, and across Europe, tracked its demographics for their queer workers. So again, intersectionality. And they found that around 86-87% of their engineers were men, 16% were women, and 0.08 were gender non-conforming. And Stack Overflow in 2021 did a survey, and they found that around 93% of their professional developers were men, just under 5% were women, and 1.26% were gender non-conforming, and about 0.7 described their gender in their own words. Otherwise, only roughly 1% of respondents were gender non-conforming, non-binary, or genderqueer, and about 0.9% described it in their own words, and 1% were trans, and that's of total respondents. And Deloitte's 2020 analysis found that 31.5% of the total workforce in tech companies were women, despite them holding just under 60% of professional workforces in the US. And a Trust Radius survey from 2021 found that 72% of women in US tech companies reported men outnumbering them by a 2-to-1 ratio, and 26 reported a 5-to-1 ratio.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Like, I even just to imagine being like the only woman in the room. Like, I imagine like a board meeting of like all these men just like sitting at a round table, and there's just like one woman.
Yeah.
And I think maybe it's like a pop culture thing that I've seen, but I've just like the woman being in the room and like trying to say something and trying to get their point across, and then it's all these men just being like ignoring her or like just talking over her, or even taking her own ideas and passing them off as their own. And I think that's just like, why are we still doing that?
Yeah. And like in most of my classes, because my classes are all sociology and feminist and gender studies, so it's mostly women outnumbering men. But like I've never taken like a STEM class at Mount Allison.
No.
But I wonder how many, especially if we look at computer science, it makes me wonder how many sort of women or non-binary or trans people there are in those classes, or if it's dominated by like white men, as we've seen in our research.
I only know one person who is in computer science, and they're a white man. So yeah, and even for like my own experience with like female dominated spaces, because I think English is a bit, it's not necessarily 50-50, but it's a little bit more, I think. But I know I've taken like women in lit classes, and it's mostly women, and there's a couple men here and there. And it's always just kind of interesting to see that.
Yeah.
And even in like first year gender studies classes, it's like mostly women, and there's a couple men that are just you can tell they're maybe kind of there for distribution, and they don't really want to be there, but it was the only thing that fit in their schedule or whatever.
Yeah. But then like I don't know how many people come to Mount Allison for computer science, or if they go, maybe they'll go to UMB or somewhere else, because we are predominantly a liberal arts university. Yeah, I don't know. And so in US tech companies, women of colour, once again, are further underrepresented. A 2021 analysis from the National Centre for Women in Information Technology found that of the women that make up the 26% of the computing force, 14% of them were white, which is the largest percentage, and then 7% were Asian, 3% were black or African American, and 2% were Hispanic or Latina. And a study by McKinsey & Company found that black, Latina, and indigenous women only comprise about 4% of the computing workforce in the US. These numbers were verified by the Anita Borg Institute for Women in Technology, and they found that of women representing the tech industry, 14% were white, 9.6% were Asian, around 2% were black, 1.7% were Latina, 0.7% were multiracial, and only 0.1% were Native American or Pacific Islander.
I think it's interesting too when people think of like, oh, there's this percentage of women or whatever in tech industries. And I'm like, that's a good way to look at it, but it's also generalizing it. And then if you look at it of like, well, most of those were white women, or most of those were straight women.
Yeah.
And then you don't think about the intersections of, yes, it's good that there are women in the tech industries to a certain amount, as they are right now. But how much of that is marginalized women, and how much of that are people that are not seeing themselves represented in the tech industries?
Yeah, I think a lot of the time when we look at sort of getting more women into industries where they're underrepresented and just having more representation for women overall, they just look at like white women. They don't look at women of colour, and they see that as like a separate thing, even though, as we've mentioned,
like a separate statistic.
Yeah, even though that's not the case, as we've discussed. And sexuality is another place where discrepancies in representation are found. And again, sexuality also intersects with race. Don't forget that. And a Stack Overflow report stated that even though they don't analyse by gender and sexuality, they do have numbers for the categories that can sort of just highlight the imbalances. So specifically, they found that just under 85% of their developers were straight, and then 5.3% were bisexual, 2.3% were gay or lesbian, but then those identities were put together in the same statistic, even though like gay men and lesbians aren't the
like
same
homogenizing
thing.
them when they're not the same thing.
So I wondered, like, if they separated them, would it be lower again for lesbians? I imagine it would be. And then 1.5% identified as queer. And then they also stated that these numbers can decrease when limited to just professional developers. And they're not very high in the first place. So when it's the people in charge, the professionals, it's just probably even worse. And so considering these numbers, I think it's important to look at the biases that can be built into technology and AI systems, and how the underrepresentation of women, other marginalized groups, and the intersections reflects in the products and the algorithms that are created.
Yeah, and I think sometimes with like the repercussions of this, I think this is something that's been discussed over and over, but it's when like women and even like young girls don't see themselves represented, whether that be like white women or whether that be women of color, and they just don't see themselves in these tech industries. They don't think that they can do it for whatever reason, even though that's completely not true. And they can do anything they want to, really. But society is just like, no, you can't. And there's not enough being done to make space for them, I think, too. That they're not doing enough. Like, tech industries aren't necessarily doing enough to make their spaces welcoming and inclusive for everybody. So it's harder to get into them.
Yeah. And I think, like, the idea that women can't do it comes from sort of the societal disadvantage that has been pushed on to women, that like makes it more difficult for them to get into these industries. But at the same time, I think it's also important to say that we're not sort of saying that there needs to be more representation of women in tech, because that would be like a, air quotes, more respectable career, as it's often sort of thought to be. I think a lot of people think that typically female dominated jobs are like less respectable, or like not as good of a career as cyber and IT. So that's not really what we're saying, that, you know, more women in tech because it would be better. And, you know, when getting more women into these industries, we don't want it in a way where it's just as they are right now with no structural change.
Yeah.
But sort of how structural change can be made, and if it's not, how are these industries continuing to like perpetuate different forms of oppression and bias and bigotry. So there are many concerns about AI and its risks that it can have on different people in different fields of work. We'll discuss this more in the following episodes.
The next episode we'll be talking more specifically about algorithmic bias and how bias shows up in AI, as well as what that means for different forms of oppression.